Hello everyone, this is Sunday and I had promised to do a commentary on lecture 6 of the Foundations of Esotericism, but I've been thinking about some of the comments, and the one comment was to actually make some more commentary than just a recapitulation of what's in the lectures. I thought that I had subtly been giving a broader perspective, but at this point I'm going to make one commentary on lecture 5. So before we go to lecture 6, I'm going to add another perspective to what we've read in lecture 5, especially about the senses. So this will be a slightly shorter video, and the aspect that I would like to comment on is this idea of an active and a passive set of senses that came at the end of lecture 5, and where we could go with that, especially in the light of some of the ideas of where the human being is heading in our evolutionary capacities to become creative out of having excluded the world out of ourselves, and by contemplating the various kingdoms of nature, taking things into us at a higher level and turning it into a creative force, what is already at work within ourselves in that realm in regards to where we are. And we read at the end of lecture 5 that we have at this point in the realm of the air, we hear, that's the receptive part of the sense organ, and then what we hear in sound we can change into concepts, and then speak is the active side of that set of senses. So a receptive sense of hearing and an activity of speaking being more an outgoing sense as a transformation. And if we look at that, we could see that the senses in a way possibly are related to part of our breathing organism. So we have in our breathing, we have the capacity to breathe in the air, we take in oxygen, and that oxygen obviously goes through a whole process in our body and combines with the carbon that we're producing to breathe out the carbon dioxide, and that cycle then becomes part of the breathing and the photosynthesis in the plant to produce the oxygen again. But if we're going to look at these things, Steiner also asks us to contemplate some other aspects of how the senses work as part of the breathing organism. So he's given us the picture in lecture 5. We take in through the hearing, we combine it in the ingoing part of the breathing of that sense with the thought, and then we breathe it out again, so to say, through speech. And then he challenges us to consider that 2 more senses are developing, that the warmth of the heart is developing, that through the warmth of the heart we are taking in the warmth of the world and starting to digest it. And at this point we are starting to develop an outgoing sense in the pituitary gland. So at this point the warmth also has a capacity. We could see that as the compassion, the loving action that we are possibly breathing out into the world is part of the outgoing sense that we are doing. And then he says that we also have a third or a 7th sense. So the warmth is going to be the 6th sense that develops from that. And the 7th sense is the one where we have an in-breathing through the eye and an out-breathing through what will develop in the pituitary gland. And when we consider that in another place, not necessarily in these lecture cycles, but it would have done ask us to consider what do we breathe in through the eyes. So just as in the breath, we breathe in oxygen amongst all the other elements, and that goes through a whole process in the body, and we breathe out the carbon dioxide, which becomes part of the life being of the plant world around us. He asks us to picture this, that when we are perceiving the light, a very refined form of silica comes into our body, and that through the senses, in this in-breathing through the eyes and developing the pituitary gland into an out-breathing organism in the future, we will also have the capacity, or already we have in a very refined form, so not necessarily only in a purely physically measurable content like the carbon dioxide and oxygen process in the physical breath, But if the eyes are an in-breathing sense, there is a combination that takes place with the oxygen that we breathe into our lungs, and we breathe out, we're beginning to breathe out on the breath, but also through the pituitary gland, silicic acid. So that's quite interesting. What is silicic acid? Silicic acid is the parent material. If you look it up, you can Google it, as you can do anything these days. But silicic acid is the parent material for all the silicates. So the things that produce plants, the things that actually start to become the base material for the production of everything that's created out of silica. And as we've sort of already touched on in these lectures, the plants and the things that come from the silicas already eventually die away and become the stones and the physical material. So we already see that in this capacity of these developing senses. So he talks about the 5 basic senses, and that we're developing this sense number 6, the breathing out of warmth, but then also the breathing out of what we see in the silicic acid. That we start to breathe out silicic acid, we actually are starting to produce not just carbon dioxide, which gives life and substance to the plants, but in the silicic acid we are already starting to produce matter that eventually, as we develop and transform our speaking through then the warmth and the future senses, we will be able to bring forth and procreate literally out of ourself. We won't need the dualistic world that we live in anymore. We're starting to create a world whereby, not the close future, but in the far distant future, we will be able to breathe forth substances that have been breathed in through the senses, the senses then transformed within our bodies. We will also start to be able to breathe out substances, just as the trees breathe out oxygen, and all the way the trees take in the carbon dioxide and build their body from it, so too will the human being in the future, through the senses, take in things from the outer world, transform it and breathe out in raw material. Then the ideas that we have that live behind our speech, eventually we will be able to bring forth other forms of creation than just the technology, which is how the ideas live in our creation now, as we can take the raw material of the world, put an idea into it and create a table, a chair. All the various things that we do in the world around us is already part of a way that we take the world and imbue it with our ideas. Eventually we will also be able to breathe forth a substance for which we will be able to create living form. So that's a little bit of a commentary further than what's in the actual lecture 5, to consider that we as the human beings will also, through the course of evolution, which is a very long process, we will come to that in the next lectures, how long a process the evolution of consciousness is, and the transformation of the human being into creator beings, people that can dream a creation in the far distant future, and the morality that we will need to develop before we can actually do that is part of what we need to consider. But even at this point, already the human being is breathing forth in refined form silicic acid, which is quite an interesting thing. Now, there may be some commentary that, how do we know this? How do we prove this? This is just a thing that Steiner says. One of the things that we can consider is that we are developing slowly but surely more and more machines, spectrometers that are able to read more and more some of the subtle things that have been known esoterically are becoming more and more measurable, and there will be a number of things. Steiner talks about a number of things that in the future will also be able to be measured by scientific instrumentation. One of them, for example, will be that we'll be able to develop a machine that will be able to read how a spirit works through the placental body into the genetic formation of a embryo. He said that eventually machines will be invented that can read that. And I believe that these sorts of things, eventually science, he says, all things that he says, science will find ways of measuring and confirming these things in a sort of a materialistic measurement way. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but just because these ideas aren't measurable yet doesn't mean that they aren't actually happening. So just as a little scientific commentary on that as well. So I wish you well, and let's keep going. Read chapter 6. Some of you may have caught up with the reading, but maybe tomorrow or Tuesday I'll give a commentary on chapter 6 with maybe a broader perspective than just a recap of the lecture. Thanks. Cheers. Keep well. Thanks for watching.